Windows president Pavan Davuluri admits that the company needs to improve Windows in ways that are meaningful for people.
Microsoft Copilot was a huge failure.
The story Microsoft does not want anyone to assemble
They don't like the Windows 11 AI.
is scattered across government press releases.
The AI is the biggest technical thing ever in my lifetime.
Leaked enterprise documents, hospital compliance memos, and developer survey data published across 3 continents. Individually, each piece looks like a regional story about a specific sector dealing with a specific problem. Connect them and the picture that emerges is something Microsoft has never faced before. Not a competitor eating its lunch. Not a superior product taking market share. A coordinated global rejection of Windows 11 by the governments, enterprises, healthcare systems, and developers who were supposed to be its most stable foundation. The financial signal arrived in June 2025, when Microsoft's Q3 earnings call revealed an 18% year-over-year decline in Windows revenue in a single quarter. CFO Amy Hood offered language about market dynamics and refresh cycle timing. The analyst community did not accept it. A Goldman Sachs analyst asked directly how much of the revenue decline was attributable to enterprises refusing to deploy Windows 11. The answer was an admission that deployment delays were occurring across multiple segments. Translation from corporate language into plain English: businesses are rejecting Windows 11 at meaningful scale. Microsoft stock dropped 7% in after-hours trading. The company shed approximately $180 billion in market capitalization overnight. The next morning, reporting based on leaked internal documents revealed that IT departments at Fortune 500 companies were drafting migration plans away from Windows. Not delayed upgrade timelines. Exit strategies. South Korea moved first, and moved decisively. In May 2025, South Korea's Ministry of Science and ICT issued a formal directive requiring all government agencies to migrate away from Windows 11 within 18 months. The official rationale cited national security concerns related to data collection. The operational reality was more specific. Windows 11 had become functionally problematic for Korean government use. The Korean language input system was degraded compared to its Windows 10 predecessor. Performance had declined substantially. The mandatory Microsoft account requirement created direct conflicts with Korean data sovereignty legislation. The directive covered 1.2 million government computers. Microsoft responded by sending executives to Seoul with an offer package that included a special government edition of Windows 11 with reduced telemetry, improved Korean language support, and significant pricing concessions. The Korean government rejected the package in its entirety. By that point, the government had already committed $340 million to developing Harmony KR, a custom Linux distribution built on Ubuntu and optimized for Korean language and government security requirements. 18,000 IT staff had been trained on Linux administration. 140,000 computers had completed a pilot migration. The infrastructure for departure was already in place. Microsoft lost South Korea's government market completely. The corporate sector began watching. Samsung initiated Linux testing across 80,000 employee workstations. LG began evaluating Ubuntu for 35,000 systems. Hyundai started a Linux pilot for 28,000 computers. When a government of that scale leads a platform exit, the enterprises that operate within its regulatory environment tend to follow. Australia's departure came from a different direction, but arrived at the same destination. The driver in Australia was not government mandate but healthcare compliance. Royal Melbourne Hospital tested Windows 11 on 200 workstations and discovered that recall, even in its supposedly disabled state, was capturing screenshots of patient records. That finding triggered an immediate legal review. Copilot was found to be transmitting medical data fragments to Microsoft servers for processing. Both behaviors created direct conflicts with Australian Privacy Act requirements governing health information. The hospital's legal department concluded that deploying Windows 11 across its 4,200 workstations would expose the institution to liability it could not accept. The migration path chosen was Red Hat Enterprise Linux configured specifically for healthcare deployment, with AI features absent, cloud connectivity disabled, and data boundaries enforced at the architecture level rather than the settings menu. Migration began in March 2025. 800 computers completed the transition with zero compliance incidents and lower per-unit costs than the Windows licensing structure they replaced. St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney followed with 3,100 computers moving to Linux. Royal Adelaide Hospital committed 2,400 systems. Alfred Hospital in Melbourne added 1,900. Across Australia's major healthcare institutions, the pattern was consistent. Deploying Windows 11 creates legal exposure that healthcare administrators cannot manage. Switching to Linux eliminates that exposure entirely. The UK's National Health Service issued guidance in April. recommending that trusts not deploy Windows 11 on systems accessing patient data without completing a formal legal review. Many concluded it was more efficient to migrate than to fight compliance battles that Windows 11's architecture made unavoidable. Canada and Germany began similar evaluations. Windows 11's data collection features had made it structurally incompatible with healthcare privacy requirements across multiple legal jurisdictions simultaneously. Brazil's response was the most sweeping in scale and the most explicit in its reasoning. The Brazilian government launched the Computing Sovereignty Initiative in February 2025, with a stated goal of eliminating dependency on foreign software for critical government functions. The target was identified directly as Microsoft Windows. The plan called for migrating 2.8 million government computers to Linux Soberano, a domestically developed Linux distribution, within 4 years. The reasoning behind the initiative was not primarily that Windows 11 performed poorly, though it did. The reasoning was geopolitical. Brazil had observed how American government pressure on technology companies created data access vulnerabilities for foreign governments using American software infrastructure. Brazil had watched European governments struggle with GDPR compliance while running American operating systems. The decision was made that computing infrastructure for government operations needed to be auditable, controllable, and located entirely outside the dependency chain that Windows represented. Windows 11's aggressive data collection behavior made that decision urgent rather than aspirational. Petrobras, the state-owned oil company, began migrating 45,000 workstations to Linux Soberano. Banco do Brasil began evaluating migration for 78,000 systems. Eletrobras initiated Linux testing for 12,000 computers. The private sector, watching the government and major state enterprises move, began making its own calculations about the risk of remaining inside the Windows ecosystem. China's migration had been underway for years, but Windows 11 compressed the timeline dramatically. China's Cyberspace Administration updated its guidance in April 2025, requiring all government agencies and state-owned enterprises to complete Windows migration by December 2027. That deadline was 18 months earlier than the previous target. The cited justification was that Windows 11's data collection architecture posed security risks that were unacceptable for government and enterprise operations. The domestic alternatives receiving the migrating workloads were all Linux-based: Kylin OS, Deepin, and UOS, all developed by Chinese companies and all auditable by Chinese security agencies, absorbed the transition. The scale was 62 million government and state enterprise computers, switching away from Windows over 30 months. The private sector moved in parallel. Alibaba migrated 140,000 employee systems to Deepin. Tencent moved 98,000 to UOS. ByteDance initiated Kylin testing across 52,000 workstations. Microsoft's projected revenue loss from China over the following 3 years was estimated at approximately $8 billion annually. The loss was not the result of a competitive product winning the market. It was the result of Windows 11's architecture being fundamentally incompatible with Chinese digital sovereignty requirements and Microsoft having no credible path to making it compatible. The European Commission investigation added regulatory weight to what was already a significant voluntary migration trend across the continent. Preliminary findings from the Commission's GDPR compliance review of Windows 11, leaked in May, identified multiple violation categories: data collection occurring without adequate user consent, transmission of personal data outside the European Union without proper safeguards in place, an inability for users to genuinely opt out of data collection without degrading core functionality, insufficient transparency about what data was being collected and how it was being used downstream. The potential penalties under a formal violation finding included fines reaching up to 4% of Microsoft's global revenue, a figure in the range of $10 billion. More consequentially, the Commission held authority to order Windows 11 withdrawn from the European market pending architectural remediation, and to mandate the removal of specific features including Recall and Copilot from European deployments. Microsoft engaged in aggressive lobbying, offering enhanced transparency measures and the possibility of a specially architected European edition with stronger privacy controls. The Commission's preliminary posture reflected skepticism toward commitments Microsoft had made in previous regulatory engagements. European businesses were not waiting for the investigation to resolve. German companies deployed 340,000 Linux systems in the first quarter of 2025. French businesses migrated 180,000 workstations. Italian companies switched 95,000. The migration was happening proactively, driven by legal departments concluding that Windows 11 created GDPR liability regardless of how the Commission's formal review concluded. The Fortune 500 internal documents leaked in May revealed that the rejection was not confined to foreign governments or regulated industries. 83 major American corporations had active internal planning underway to reduce Windows dependency strategically. A memo from one Fortune 5 technology company stated directly that Windows 11 created unacceptable operational risks across performance, security, and compliance dimensions and directed an immediate halt to Windows 11 deployments, while Mac and Linux alternatives were evaluated for 40% of the workforce. 40% of 95,000 employees represented 38,000 users at a single company exiting Windows. Across the 83 companies with similar planning documents, the projected user count moving off Windows ranged from 2 to 3 million enterprise seats, representing $800 million to $1.2 billion in annual Microsoft revenue from American corporations in Microsoft's home market. The reasons appearing consistently across the documentation were identical regardless of industry. Performance degradation compared to Windows 10. AI features creating workflow disruption rather than productivity improvement. Security concerns generated by recalls architecture. Compliance exposure from data collection that legal departments could not sign off on. Hardware upgrade costs required to meet Windows 11's system requirements. Elevated support costs driven by user resistance to the new platform. Every company arriving at the same conclusion from independent analysis. Windows 11 costs more to operate and delivers less value than its predecessor. The developer data may be the most strategically significant indicator of all, because of what developer platform choices predict about application ecosystems 3 to 5 years forward. Stack Overflow's June 2025 survey placed Windows usage among professional developers at 38.2%, down from 41.8% in March, down from 47% in December, down from 53% a year earlier. Mac had reached 34.7%. Linux sat at 27.1%. Windows was barely ahead of Mac among the professional development community, and the trajectory suggested parity or reversal before the end of the year. The downstream consequence of this shift is architectural rather than cosmetic. Applications being built today by developers working on Mac and Linux are optimized for Mac and Linux first. Windows versions arrive later, receive less attention, and increasingly become secondary targets. Major productivity applications have already demonstrated this pattern. Figma launched its desktop application on Mac exclusively, with a Windows version arriving 6 months later. Linear maintained Mac exclusivity for a year. Superhuman released on Mac with no Windows version announced. These are not legacy applications from a previous era. These are the tools that the professional and technical workforce is adopting now. When developers stop building for Windows first, the application ecosystem that made Windows the default platform begins to dissolve. That dissolution, once started, does not reverse. By July 2025, Windows' overall desktop market share had fallen to 62.3%, crossing below the 65% threshold that analysts had identified as the level at which network effects begin working against a platform rather than for it. Linux had reached 9.1%. Mac sat at 19.4%. The directional trend across every segment was consistent. Windows declining, competitors growing, the gap narrowing faster than at any previous measured period. Microsoft's Windows revenue trajectory projected from current data points toward a 35 to 40% decline by 2028, compressing from $22 billion annually to somewhere between $13 and $14 billion. The cascade consequences extended beyond Windows revenue directly. Windows licensing loss reduces Office deployment. Reduced Office deployment affects Azure adoption patterns. Azure adoption contraction affects the cloud revenue line that Microsoft had positioned as its growth engine. The total estimated revenue impact from the Windows 11 failure scenario reached $40 to $60 billion annually by 2030 across the full ecosystem dependency chain. What makes this moment different from every previous prediction of Windows decline is that the migration is not being driven by a better product winning competitive evaluations. It is being driven by Windows 11 being rejected as operationally unacceptable by institutions that had no ideological motivation to leave, and every practical reason to stay. South Korea's government did not want to spend $340 million building a custom Linux distribution. Australian hospitals did not want to undertake complex migrations in the middle of ongoing healthcare operations. Brazilian government agencies did not want to retrain millions of civil servants on unfamiliar software. Fortune 500 IT departments did not want to manage platform transitions across tens of thousands of users. They made those choices anyway because Windows 11 left them without a credible alternative. The platform that Bill Gates built and that Microsoft spent 3 decades making the default answer to every personal computing question is being abandoned, not because something better came along, but because it became something its users could no longer trust, afford, or legally deploy. That is a different kind of failure, and it does not have a patch.